Another very easy to identify group of fungal diseases are the rust diseases. And again, we're really talking about a large group of fungi that can cause these diseases. They're all very closely related, and they can cause problems on a variety of different types of plants. Rust fungi tend to be relatively host specific. In this particular case, I'm showing you an example of what's called rose rust. And this is a very classic looking rust, because what you tend to get with the classic looking rust, if you look at the top surface of the leaf, you're going to see some kind of either brownish or orangish spots. But what you really need to do to identify it as a rust disease is basically flip the leaf over and take a look on the bottom surface of the leaf and look for little erupting masses of fungal spores that are being produced. And these are typically kind of a bright orange or a gold yellow color, or they can be kind of a rusty brown sort of color. What you can do is actually, if you rub your finger or a Kleenex or a white handkerchief across the surface of the leaf, if you have a rust, you're actually going to rub off streaks of color. And that's really the classic way of identifying whether or not you have one of these rust diseases. There are a lot of leaf diseases that are caused by fungi that will produce kind of brownish or orange spots, but it's only the rust where you actually get this spore production that you can rub off with your finger. In this particular case, rose rust is what's called an Hetericious Rus. That means that this particular rust fungus is able to complete its entire life cycle on a single host. So this particular fungus just lives on rose plants. In addition to these really orangey, powdery spores that are produced, late in the season it will start to convert its spore production into an overwintering spore. That's called a teleospore. These orange ones are called eurydiaspores. What I love about the teleospores of this particular fungus, this rose rust, is it looks like a little corn dog. Actually, if you look at it under the microscope, there's a part of it that looks like a frankfurter, and then a part of it that looks like a stalk. And actually, these resting spores, these teleospores, are so large that you can actually see them by eye on the leaf surface. They actually look like little insect droppings. Watch for that. This is a disease that we haven't seen a lot of in Wisconsin. It's more of a warm weather sort of rust. But we're seeing more of it as our climate tends to warm up and we get milder winters. So you may see this on your roses in the future. The other major group of rusts are what are called the Hetericious Rus. As opposed to the Hetericious Rus, the Hetericious Rus require two different hosts in order to complete their life cycle. Probably the most common one that folks tend to see is one called cedar apple rust. And that particular rust fungus spends part of its life on red cedar or junipers in general, and then the other part of its life cycle on woody rosaceous plants like apple, crabapple, hawthorn, and quince. What you typically see first in the growing season is the stage on junipers, and it's quite vivid. If you've ever seen these large marmalade-like masses that occur on junipers, particularly red cedar, you've seen cedar apple rust. Kind of an amusing story. We had a student on campus who told the head of our grounds crew one time that she really loved mid-May to mid-June on campus because that's when the junipers bloomed. And what the student was actually seeing were these masses of spores that were being produced by the cedar apple rust fungus. The spores that are produced in those masses do not reinfect the junipers. They actually infect the alternate host, so it's one of those rosaceous plants like apple, crabapple, hawthorn, or quince. And then what you start to see mid-season on those hosts are very, very distinctive leaf spots that are about the size maybe of a dime or a nickel. They're usually very bright in color, yellow or orange. And if you look at the lower surface, eventually you'll start to see these little tentacles that are formed below the leaf surface, and these produce spores that eventually reinfect the junipers. This fungus bounces back and forth. Other types of Hetericious Rus that you may have come across, there's one called white pine blister rust, and this can be a serious problem on white pine where it can kill white pine trees. It actually causes an infection on the branches and causes the branches to die. The alternate host for that particular rust fungus is gooseberry or currants, where you actually see symptoms that are very similar to what I'm showing here on rose. So you get these very bright orange pustules or masses of spores that are produced on the leaves. The other alternating rust that you may have encountered is the one that goes to turf. If you've ever walked out into your lawn and gotten orange shoes, you're dealing with an alternating or Hetericious rust. That particular rust spends part of its life cycle on turf, the other part of its life cycle on, of all things, buckthorn. If you're not familiar with buckthorn, it's a very invasive woody ornamental. It will take over understories in wooded areas, and if you need another reason to hate that particular plant, there are three. It's invasive, it's an alternate host for this grass rust, And then a third reason to hate it, particularly if you're a farmer who grows soybeans, is that it's an overwintering site for soybean aphid. In terms of management of rust diseases, that really depends upon the type of rust that you're dealing with. Oftentimes with the Hetericious Rus, good cleanup of the infected leaves, also pruning on roses of infected canes can help with management of that particular disease. With the alternating rust, sometimes choosing to grow only one of the hosts. For example, with cedar apple rust, you decide whether you're going to be a connoisseur of junipers or a connoisseur of woody rosaceous plants and grow only one of them. Although quite frankly, in tight urban settings, that doesn't often really work that well, because you may decide that you're going to grow just crab apples, but your neighbor will grow some junipers and the plants will be close enough for spores to float back and forth. There are also fungicide treatments, but if you're ever interested in that particular option, that's a situation where you'd want to contact someone like me to get a specific recommendation for the particular rust that you're dealing with. But again, rusts in general are diseases that you should be able to identify by eye, so definitely watch for those out in the landscape as you look for plant diseases in the future.